Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones that never heal, leaving us to wander through life like ghosts of who we used to be. For 7 long winters, Haldor Grimsson has lived alone in the Norwegian wilderness, haunted by memories of everything he lost. The giant warrior once commanded respect across the fjords, but war took his family and left him empty. Now he exists in a cabin surrounded by endless snow and silence. On this bitter night, as he steps outside into the howling wind, he finds a young woman collapsed at his door. She's barely alive, bleeding in the snow, running from something terrible. Haldor carries her inside and begins nursing her back to health. As days pass, this broken stranger slowly awakens something in the old warrior's heart he thought was dead forever. But her past is catching up, and soon Haldor must decide whether to fight again. What secret is this mysterious woman hiding that could destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin stood like a sentinel against the endless white, its thick timber walls scarred by countless storms, yet holding firm against nature's fury. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, a thin grey line dissolving into the pewter sky. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, where civilization had never bothered to venture, Haldor Grimsson had built his exile. The structure was simple but solid. One large room dominated by a massive fieldstone fireplace, a sleeping alcove carved into the back wall, and a small kitchen area where dried herbs hung from the rafters like ancient runes. Animal pelts covered the plank floors, and heavy wooden shutters blocked the worst of the wind. Above the mantel, a war axe hung in silent testament to another life, its blade still mirror-bright despite years of disuse. Haldor moved through the space with practiced economy, each step deliberate and measured. At 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders that could fill a doorframe, he seemed too large for the confines of his sanctuary. His beard, once golden like summer wheat, had turned silver-white during his years of solitude. Deep lines etched his weathered face, mapping decades of battle and more recent seasons of grief. The woman lay unconscious on the rough-hewn bed, her breathing shallow but steady. 3 days had passed since he'd found her, collapsed against his fence, more dead than alive. Her blood-stained woolen cloak, torn and mud-caked, hung drying near the fire. The fabric was well made, he'd noticed, not the rough weave of common folk. Whoever she was, she'd known comfort before this flight through the wilderness. Haldor ladled warm broth from the pot over the fire, the steam carrying scents of venison and wild onions. He'd been preparing these simple meals for one person for so long that cooking for 2 felt strange, almost forgotten. As he approached the bedside, the woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of storm clouds. She jerked upright with a gasp, then immediately winced as movement sent pain shooting through her wounded side. Her gaze darted around the cabin before settling on his massive frame, and for a moment pure terror flashed across her features. "Peace," Haldor said, his voice rusty from disuse. He set the bowl on the small table beside the bed and stepped back, giving her space. "You are safe here." The woman's hand moved instinctively to her ribs, where he'd bound the deep gash with clean linen. Her fingers found the careful stitching he'd done by firelight, using skills learned in battlefield surgery. She studied his face, searching for deception or threat, finding neither. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Haldor." He settled into the wooden chair across the room, making himself appear less imposing. "This is my home. I found you dying in the snow." She nodded slowly, memory returning in fragments. "How long?" 3 days. "You lost much blood." He gestured toward the bowl. "You should eat." As she reached for the broth with trembling hands, Haldor caught sight of a thin scar along her wrist. Old, deliberate, not from accident or battle, but from chains. His expression darkened. Though he said nothing, the warmth of the soup brought color back to her pale cheeks. "My name is Astrid," she said finally. "I owe you my life. You owe me nothing." Haldor rose and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters at the storm-swept landscape beyond. "Where did you come from?" The silence stretched long enough that he turned back. Astrid stared into the bowl, her jaw set with determination that couldn't quite hide the fear underneath. "South," she said. "From Bergen. Alone?" Another pause. "Yes." The lie hung in the air between them like smoke. Haldor had heard enough false words in his lifetime to recognize them, but he'd also learned when not to press. Whatever had driven her into the wilderness in winter, bleeding and half dead, would reveal itself in time. Or it would find them both. "Rest," he said simply. "The storm will pass." Over the following days, a strange routine developed between them. Haldor would wake before dawn, as was his habit, and tend the fire before checking his trap lines. The forest provided well enough for 2 rabbits and the occasional deer, along with stored grain and preserved meat from his autumn hunting. When he returned, Astrid would be sitting up in bed, always alert, always listening for sounds beyond the cabin walls. She was healing quickly, her color returning with each meal. But she remained guarded, answering his few questions with careful words that revealed nothing of substance. Still, he caught moments when she thought he wasn't watching, the way she touched the war axe above the fireplace with something approaching reverence. How she studied the rune-carved wooden bowl he'd made during his second winter of exile. The relief that crossed her features each evening when he barred the door. "You were a warrior," she said on the 5th day. Breaking the comfortable silence, as they shared a simple dinner of roasted meat and root vegetables, Haldor paused in his eating. "Once, the axe, the way you move, the scars." She gestured at the white lines visible on his forearms where his sleeves had rolled back. "You fought in the clan wars?" "I did." He set down his knife. "Long ago. My father told stories of Haldor Grimsson, the shield breaker. They said you could cleave through a shield wall like wheat before the scythe." Her eyes searched his face. "They said you died at Ravenshollow." Something cold settled in Haldor's chest at the mention of that cursed place. "Part of me did." He rose abruptly and walked to the window, though night had fallen hours ago and nothing was visible beyond the glass. The memories came anyway, as they always did when that battle was named. The screams of dying men, the smoke of burning thatch, the weight of his axe growing heavier with each swing until he could barely lift it. And afterward, the terrible silence where his family's voices should have been. "I'm sorry," Astrid said softly. "I shouldn't have. The man you speak of is dead." Haldor's voice carried the finality of stone. "He died with everyone else at Ravenshollow." She said nothing more that night, but when he turned from the window, he found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not pity. He would have turned her out into the snow for that. Something deeper. Understanding, perhaps. The look of someone who had also lost everything that mattered. The next morning brought the first clear sky in over a week. Sunlight streamed through the windows, setting dust motes dancing in golden beams. Astrid was sitting up in bed, her color fully returned, when Haldor entered with an armload of firewood. "The bleeding has stopped," she announced, lifting her shift slightly to show the bound wound. "And the fever broke during the night." "Good." He stacked the wood beside the hearth with methodical precision. "You should be able to travel soon." The words surprised him, even as he spoke them. For 7 years, he'd craved nothing but solitude, yet the thought of her leaving brought an unexpected hollowness to his chest. He'd grown accustomed to her presence, the soft sound of her breathing in the night, the way she hummed quietly while mending her torn cloak, the warmth of shared conversation after years of talking only to himself. "Where would I go?" Astrid asked quietly. "Wherever you were headed before." "I wasn't heading anywhere. I was running." Haldor straightened, a piece of split pine still in his hands. "From what?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with the careful deliberation of someone revealing a dangerous secret, she pulled back her hair to expose her neck. 3 small scars marked the base of her throat, perfectly round and unmistakably deliberate. "From men who put those there," she whispered. "Men who would see them as proof of ownership." The firewood clattered to the floor. In 2 swift strides, Haldor crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, his massive hands gentle as he touched the scars. Rage, cold and familiar, woke in his chest like a sleeping dragon. "Slave traders," he said. the words carrying the weight of a death sentence. Astrid nodded. I was taken during a raid on our village, sold in Bergen's black markets to a man who collected pretty things. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I escaped 3 weeks ago. They've been hunting me ever since. How many? 6, led by the one who bought me, Thorvald the Blackheart. They call him that for good reason. She met his eyes. They won't stop coming. They can't afford to let word spread that someone escaped. Haldor rose slowly, his mind already calculating distances, terrain, probable routes. How far behind? I don't know. The storm may have slowed them, but they have tracking hounds. And they know these mountains. Her voice broke slightly. I never meant to bring this to your door. I'll leave as soon as... No. The word came out harder than he'd intended. He softened his tone. You'll stay. You don't understand. These men are killers. If they find me here, then they'll find more than they bargained for. Something shifted in the air between them, heavy with unspoken promise. Astrid studied his face, seeing past the greying beard and weathered features to the steel underneath. This was not the broken hermit she'd taken him for, but something else entirely, something dangerous that had been sleeping and was now awakening. The shield breaker is dead, she said softly, echoing his earlier words. Haldor walked to the fireplace and lifted the war axe from its place of honor. The weapon was perfectly balanced, its double-edged head gleaming in the firelight. He ran his thumb along the blade, testing its sharpness. Perhaps, he said quietly, but I am still Haldor Grimsson, and I protect what is mine. The howling began at midnight. Haldor's eyes snapped open at the sound, his warrior instincts cutting through sleep like a blade through silk. Not wolves. He knew their voices too well after 7 years in these mountains. This was different, deliberate, the deep baying of hounds on a scent trail, growing closer with each passing moment. He rolled from his sleeping furs without a sound, bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. Across the cabin, Astrid sat bolt upright in bed, her face pale as fresh snow in the dying firelight. They found me, she whispered. Haldor pressed his finger to his lips, then moved to the window. Through a gap in the shutters, he could see torchlight flickering between the trees, 6 flames, dancing like malevolent spirits in the darkness. They were perhaps half a mile away, following the creek bed that led directly to his clearing. How? He asked quietly, turning back to Astrid. The blood. Her voice carried the weight of despair. I left a trail when I collapsed at your door. The snow covered it, but the hounds... She buried her face in her hands. I should have kept running. I should never have stopped here. Too late for such thoughts now. Haldor moved with sudden purpose, crossing to the wooden chest beside his bed. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay items he hadn't touched in years. Leather braces studded with iron, a mail shirt that had turned aside countless blades, a belt bearing his father's sword. Can you travel? Astrid threw back the furs and swung her legs over the side of the bed. She winced as the movement pulled at her stitches, but stood without complaint. I can manage. Good. There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. Hidden entrance behind the grain barrel. He pulled the mail shirt over his head, the familiar weight settling on his shoulders like an old friend. Wait there until... No. Astrid's voice cut through his words with surprising strength. I won't cower in a hole while you face them alone. 6 men against 1 is poor odds for anyone. Then it's fortunate you won't be facing them alone. She reached for her torn cloak, then paused, her fingers closing instead around the iron fire poker beside the hearth. The weapon was crude but sturdy, its pointed tip worn smooth by years of use. In her hands, it looked almost delicate, but Haldor could see the determination in her stance. You're wounded, he said. I'm alive because of you. That makes this my fight too. Before he could argue further, the baying of the hounds grew suddenly louder. They'd reached the edge of his clearing. Haldor strapped his father's sword to his side and lifted the war axe from above the mantle. The weapon felt different in his hands now, not a relic of the past, but a tool with purpose. Stay behind me, he said. No matter what happens. He moved to the door and lifted the heavy wooden bar, setting it aside with careful silence. The leather hinges made no sound as he eased the door open, just wide enough to peer outside. The torch-bearing riders had emerged from the tree line, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. At their head rode a man whose very presence seemed to corrupt the night around him. Thorvald the Blackheart was smaller than Haldor had expected, but there was something reptilian about his lean frame and sharp features. His dark hair hung in greasy braids adorned with silver rings, and even at this distance Haldor could see the cruel intelligence in his pale eyes. The slave trader sat his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. "Spread out," Thorvald commanded, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Surround the building. If the girl is inside, she's not leaving." The other riders fanned out as ordered, hard men with scarred faces and weapons worn smooth by use. Mercenaries and cutthroats, Haldor judged, the kind who would slit a throat for the price of a meal. They moved with professional efficiency, closing off all escape routes with practiced ease. "You in the cabin," Thorvald called out. "I know you can hear me. Send out the girl, and you can go back to whatever pathetic life you've carved out in this wasteland. Refuse, and I'll burn you out like a tick." Haldor stepped into the doorway, the war axe hanging loosely in his right hand. "The girl is under my protection." Thorvald's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Your protection? Look around, old man. You're outnumbered and outmatched. I'll give you one more chance to—" He stopped mid-sentence as Haldor stepped fully into the torchlight. The slave trader's confident expression faltered as he took in the giant's true size, the quality of his mail, the casual way he held a weapon that would require both hands for most men to wield. "I know you," Thorvald said slowly. "The beard, the axe. You're supposed to be dead." "I am dead," Haldor replied quietly. "Dead men have nothing to lose." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across the slave trader's features. Then his face hardened with cruel resolve. "Dead or alive, you're still just one man. Kill him." The first attacker came from the left, spurring his horse forward with a wild cry. His sword gleamed in the torchlight as he raised it overhead, clearly intending to ride Haldor down, like a farmer threshing grain. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Haldor stepped sideways, with surprising grace for such a large man, letting the charging horse pass harmlessly by. As the rider swept past, the war axe sang through the air in a perfect arc, taking the man's head clean off his shoulders. The headless corpse tumbled from the saddle, while the riderless horse galloped into the darkness. "Kill him!" Thorvald screamed, his composure finally cracking. "Kill him now!" Two more riders charged simultaneously from different angles, hoping to catch Haldor between them. But the giant warrior had fought in shield walls against impossible odds, and these mounted thugs were nothing compared to the disciplined soldiers he'd once faced. He dropped to one knee as the riders converged, letting their sword strokes pass over his head, then surged upward with devastating force. His axe caught the first horse in the chest, dropping the animal instantly. The rider tried to roll clear, but Haldor's follow-through took him across the ribs, splitting mail and flesh with equal ease. The second rider wheeled his mount away, seeking distance, but Haldor was already moving. He grabbed a burning brand from the ground and hurled it with deadly accuracy. The torch struck the man square in the face, setting his beard ablaze and sending him tumbling from his horse in a screaming, flaming bundle. 3 men down in as many heartbeats. The remaining attackers pulled back, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Spread out," Thorvald snarled. "Use the trees for cover." He can't watch all directions at once. But as the surviving men tried to retreat to the forest, a new voice cut through the night, Astrid's clear soprano raised in an ancient war song. The melody was haunting and primal, and it seemed to give Haldor new strength, even as it struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. She stood in the doorway behind him, the fire poker in her hands, her voice weaving a spell of courage and defiance that echoed off the surrounding mountains. It was a song the old warriors knew, a battle hymn from the days when gods still walked among men. The sound seemed to break something inside Thorvald. His face twisted with rage and madness as he drew his own sword, a curved blade that gleamed with an oily sheen. Poison, Haldor realized. The slave trader meant to end this himself. Enough! Thorvald spurred his horse directly at Haldor, abandoning all pretense of strategy. "I'll carve your heart out myself, you ancient relic." Haldor stood his ground, axe raised, as the poisoned blade swept toward his throat. At the last possible moment, he shifted his weight and brought his weapon up in a devastating uppercut. The axe head caught Thorvald's sword hand at the wrist, severing it completely. The slave trader's scream of agony pierced the night as his hand, still clutching the poisoned blade, arced through the air to land in the snow. Thorvald fell from his horse, clutching his ruined arm, his face grey with shock and blood loss. The remaining two attackers took one look at their maimed leader and fled into the forest, abandoning their master to his fate. Silence fell over the clearing like a shroud. Haldor stood among the bodies, breathing hard, steam rising from his heated flesh in the cold air. The war axe dripped steadily, painting the snow crimson at his feet. Behind him, Astrid's song faded to a whisper, then died entirely. She stared at the carnage with wide eyes, seeing for the first time the true extent of the legend she'd been living with. "Now you know," Haldor said quietly, not turning around. "This is what I was. This is what I am." Thorvald groaned at his feet, still alive but fading fast from blood loss. The slave trader looked up at Haldor with eyes already glazing over. "You think you've won?" he gasped. "There are others who know where she is. They'll come." His words trailed off into silence as death finally claimed him. Haldor stood over the body for a long moment, then looked up at Astrid. "It's not over," he said simply. She nodded, understanding. Whatever peace they'd found in this remote sanctuary was gone forever. The outside world had found them, and there would be no going back to the quiet isolation they'd shared. "What do we do now?" she asked. Haldor wiped his axe clean on Thorvald's cloak and looked out at the forest where the survivors had fled. Somewhere in that darkness, men were riding hard to spread word of what they'd witnessed. Soon others would come, more slave traders, bounty hunters, perhaps even soldiers seeking the legendary shield breaker who was supposed to be dead. "Now," he said, "we prepare for war." Dawn broke grey and cold over the blood-stained clearing. Haldor had spent the hours before sunrise dragging bodies into the forest and scattering the evidence of battle. The snow would cover the rest by midday, but experienced trackers would still be able to read the signs. Their sanctuary was compromised beyond repair. Inside the cabin, Astrid sat beside the fire, carefully cleaning Thorvald's curved sword with a strip of torn cloth. She'd insisted on taking the weapon despite its grim history, claiming she needed something better than a fire poker if more fights were coming. The blade was well balanced and sharp, though Haldor had warned her about the dark stains along its edge, remnants of the poison that had claimed other victims. "We can't stay here," she said without looking up from her work. "No." Haldor was methodically packing supplies into a leather satchel, dried meat, hard cheese, grain cakes that would keep for weeks on the trail. "The two who escaped will bring others. We have perhaps a day's head start. Where will we go?" He paused in his packing, considering their options. The question had been weighing on him since the moment Thorvald breathed his last. Every settlement within 100 miles would soon know that Haldor Grimsson lived, and that he'd killed a notorious slave trader. Some would see opportunity in that knowledge, others would see threat. Few would offer sanctuary. "North," he said finally. "To the old fortress at Ironhold." Astrid's hands stilled on the sword blade. "Ironhold was abandoned after the plague years. They say it's haunted. Good. Ghosts don't ask questions or demand tribute." Haldor cinched the satchel closed and slung it over his shoulder. "The walls are still strong, and there are stores of weapons and food hidden in the lower vaults. If we're going to make a stand, it might as well be from a position of strength." She set the cleaned sword aside and looked at him directly. "You're planning to fight them all, aren't you? Every slave trader and bounty hunter who comes seeking the reward on my head, if necessary. Why?" The question came out softer than she'd intended. "You could disappear again, find another remote valley, build another cabin, live in peace." Haldor was quiet for a long moment, his hands methodically checking the leather ties on his mail shirt. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and newer resolve. 7 years ago, I watched everything I cared about burn. My wife, my children, my hall, all turned to ash while I was away fighting someone else's war. He met her eyes. I swore then that I would never again fail to protect what mattered to me. The admission hung in the air between them, like a bridge being built with careful words. Astrid felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling beside her. "I matter to you?" she asked quietly. "You do." 2 simple words, but they carried the full weight of his commitment. Astrid rose from her seat and crossed to where he stood, reaching up to touch the silver beard that framed his weathered face. "Then we go to Ironhold together," she said. "And whatever comes after, we face it the same way." They left the cabin as the sun reached its weak zenith, following deer trails that wound through dense stands of pine and fir. Haldor led the way, his practiced eye reading sign that would be invisible to most, the bent twig that showed where someone had passed, the disturbed snow that marked a hunting trail, the subtle paths that would keep them hidden from casual observation. Astrid followed close behind, moving with a grace that surprised him. Despite her recent injury and weeks of flight, she matched his steady pace without complaint. The curved sword hung at her side, and she'd wrapped her blood-stained cloak around a simple traveling dress borrowed from his meager supplies. She looked like what she was, a refugee, fleeing for her life, but there was something unbroken in her bearing that spoke of inner strength. "Tell me about Ironhold," she said as they climbed a rocky slope that offered views of the valley behind them. "It was built 3 generations ago as a border fortress," Haldor replied, pausing to scan their back trail. "No signs of pursuit yet, but that would change. Strong walls, deep wells, and enough storage to withstand a siege. When the plague came, the garrison abandoned it rather than risk infection. Most folk consider it cursed now. And you don't?" "I've seen real curses. Ironhold just has bad memories." They pressed on through the afternoon, following ridge lines that kept them above the main valleys where trackers would expect to find their trail. The going was harder but safer, and Haldor's mountain skills proved invaluable. He knew where to find shelter from the wind, which streams were safe to drink from, and how to read the subtle signs that warned of unstable snow or hidden crevasses. As evening approached, they made camp in a shallow cave that offered protection from the elements while remaining hidden from prying eyes. Haldor built a small fire from dry wood that would produce little smoke, then set about preparing a simple meal of jerked meat and pine nut tea. "You're different out here," Astrid observed, watching him work with practiced efficiency. "How so?" "In the cabin you seemed broken, haunted, but out here you move like the warrior of old songs." She accepted the cup of steaming tea he offered. "This is your element, isn't it? The wilderness, the danger, the fight for survival." Haldor settled beside the fire, his own cup warming his hands. "Perhaps. I'd grown comfortable in my exile, but comfort makes a man soft. This," he gestured at the cave around them, the uncertain future ahead. "This reminds me who I used to be, and who was that exactly?" The question touched on memories he'd buried deep, but something about her steady gaze made him want to share the truth. A fool who thought strength could protect everyone he loved. A man who believed his reputation would shield his family from harm. His voice grew quiet. "I was away when the raiders came to my village. By the time I returned, there was nothing left but graves to dig." Astrid reached out and covered his hand with hers. "That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I chose glory over home. I chose to fight in distant battles while my own hearth went undefended." The old guilt rose in his throat like poison. "They died because I wasn't there. They died because evil men chose to kill them." "You can't be everywhere at once, Haldor. Even legends have limits." He looked at her then, really looked, seeing past the surface to the strength underneath. Here was a woman who'd endured months of slavery and degradation, who'd fled across half the kingdom with killers on her trail, who'd faced down armed riders with nothing but a fire poker. She understood something about survival that comfort could never teach. "How do you bear it?" he asked. "The memories, the loss?" "By choosing to keep living despite them." She squeezed his hand gently. and by finding people worth living for. The fire crackled softly between them, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Outside, wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying the promise of more snow. But inside their small shelter, warmth grew, not just from the flames, but from the connection building between two wounded souls who'd found unexpected solace in each other. "Tomorrow we reach Ironhold," Haldor said quietly. "And then we see what we're really made of." Neither of them slept easily that night, both knowing that dawn would bring them closer to a confrontation that would test everything they'd rebuilt together. But they faced the uncertain future side by side, and somehow that made all the difference. Ironhold emerged from the morning mist, like a vision from the old tales, massive stone walls rising from a craggy promontory, their weathered faces bearing the scars of countless storms. Even abandoned, the fortress radiated an aura of strength that made Haldor's warrior heart stir with recognition. This was a place built for war, designed to stand against any siege. The main gate hung open, its iron portcullis raised like a mouth frozen in an eternal scream. Vines had begun to claim the outer walls, and snow drifted through gaps in the battlements, but the basic structure remained sound. More importantly, Haldor could see no signs of recent habitation, no tracks in the snow, no smoke from the towers, no evidence that anyone had disturbed this place in years. "It's larger than I expected," Astrid murmured as they approached the entrance. Border fortresses were built to house full garrisons. 500 men could hold these walls against an army. Haldor's experienced eye assessed the defensive positions automatically. "The question is whether we can make it serve for two." They passed through the gate into a broad courtyard, dominated by a central keep that rose 4 stories into the grey sky. Smaller buildings clustered around the walls, barracks, armories, stables, workshops. All empty now, their doors standing open like dead eyes. The silence was absolute, except for the whisper of wind through empty windows. "I can see why people think it's haunted," Astrid said, her voice subdued by the oppressive atmosphere. Haldor led her across the courtyard toward the keep, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. "The dead don't frighten me. It's the living we need to worry about." The keep's heavy wooden doors were unlocked, but stuck fast from years of disuse. It took Haldor's considerable strength to force them open, revealing a great hall that had once echoed with the voices of warriors and the clatter of weapons. Now dust motes danced in the pale light, filtering through high windows, and their breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the vast space. Tapestries hung in rotted tatters from the walls, depicting battles and hunts from more glorious times. A massive hearth dominated one wall, cold and dark for who knew how many winters. Above it hung a faded banner bearing the crossed axes of the old border guard, a reminder of the oaths once sworn in this place. "We'll need to explore the whole fortress," Haldor said, setting down his pack. "Check the defenses, find the stores, see what's still usable." They spent the afternoon in systematic exploration, moving from building to building like ghosts, cataloging their domain. The barracks still contained wooden bunks and weapon racks, though mice had made homes in the straw mattresses. The armory held a few rusted swords and dented shields. Nothing of real value, but proof that this place had once bristled with steel. Most promising was the discovery Astrid made in the lower levels of the keep, a series of storage chambers carved directly into the bedrock. Here, sealed in stone containers and protected from moisture, they found supplies that would last for months: barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, wheels of hard cheese wrapped in wax, and casks of ale that had only grown stronger with age. "Someone planned for a long siege," Astrid observed, running her hand over a barrel of preserved fish, "and now we're the beneficiaries of their foresight." Haldor lifted one of the grain sacks, testing its weight. "We could hold here for half a year if necessary." The most significant find came in what had once been the commander's quarters, a heavy wooden chest hidden behind a loose stone in the wall. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay a collection of weapons that took Haldor's breath away. A sword of extraordinary craftsmanship, its blade inscribed with protective runes. a warhammer whose head was shaped like a snarling wolf, and most impressive of all, a longbow of yew wood so perfectly seasoned it seemed to glow in the lamplight. Masterwork weapons, Haldor breathed, lifting the bow with reverent hands. Hidden here when the fortress was abandoned, waiting for someone worthy to claim them, Astrid reached for the rune-carved sword, hefting it experimentally. It was lighter than Thorvald's poisoned blade, but felt perfectly balanced in her grip. "Do you think the commander knew we'd find them?" "I think the gods have a sense of irony." Haldor strung the bow and tested its pull. The weapon bent smoothly, its draw weight perfectly suited to his strength. Or perhaps old warriors never truly die. They just leave their weapons for the next generation. As evening fell, they established themselves in the commander's quarters, choosing the most defensible position in the fortress. From the high windows, they could see for miles in every direction. Anyone approaching Ironhold would be visible long before they reached the walls. They built their first fire in the room's small hearth, using furniture scavenged from other parts of the keep for fuel. The flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, transforming their stronghold into something almost cozy, despite its military origins. "How long do you think we have?" Astrid asked, as they shared a simple meal of preserved meat and stale bread softened in ale. "Before they come." "Not long?" Haldor gazed out the window at the darkening landscape. "Word travels fast in the slave trade. By now every bounty hunter and sellsword from here to Bergen knows there's a price on your head and mine. Any regrets about helping me?" He turned from the window to look at her, seeing how the firelight played across her features. The frightened woman he'd found dying in the snow was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. The curved sword lay within easy reach of her hand, and he had no doubt she'd use it if the need arose. "None," he said simply. "They took turns on watch that night, one sleeping while the other kept vigil at the window." The ancient stones around them seemed to pulse with memories of other warriors who'd stood guard in this same spot, waiting for enemies who might or might not come with the dawn. When Astrid woke to take the midnight watch, she found Haldor standing motionless at the window, the master bow in his hands. In the moonlight, he looked like a statue of some forgotten war god, patient and immovable as stone. "What do you see?" she asked quietly. "Torches," he replied without moving. "Still distant but moving this way. 6, no, 8 of them." She joined him at the window, peering out into the darkness. Far below in the valley, she could just make out tiny points of light winding their way up the mountain road. Even at this distance, there was something purposeful about their movement that made her stomach tighten. "How long until they reach us?" "Dawn, perhaps a little after." Haldor finally turned from the window, his face grim but determined. "Time to see if this old fortress still has teeth." They spent the remaining hours before dawn in frantic preparation, moving supplies to the most defensible positions, checking every entrance for weaknesses, preparing weapons and planning their defense. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Ironhold was as ready for siege as two people could make it. Standing on the battlements as the sun crested the mountains, they watched their enemies emerge from the tree line below. 8 mounted figures, heavily armed and moving with the confidence of professional soldiers. At their head rode a man whose black banner snapped in the morning wind, the mark of Jarl Eriksson, Bergen's most notorious slave lord. "They've sent the best," Haldor observed grimly. "Good," Astrid replied, her hand resting on the hilt of her rune-carved sword. "Let them come and see what we've learned." About being cornered. The siege of Ironhold was about to begin. The siege began with words rather than weapons. Jarl Eriksson positioned his men in a loose semicircle around Ironhold's main gate, just beyond bowshot range. The slave lord himself rode forward alone, stopping perhaps 50 yards from the walls. He was a lean man with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of calculated cruelty that came from years of trading in human misery. Haldor Grimsson. His voice carried easily across the distance. "The dead hero rises again. Come down and let us speak as reasonable men." From the battlements above the gate, Haldor drew the master longbow. The yew weapon seemed to sing as he knocked an arrow, its fletching perfectly straight. "Speak your piece from there, slave trader. My hearing is still good. Ericsson's laugh was thin and cold. You killed my business partner. Thorvald the Blackheart was crude, but he was useful. His death has cost me considerable profit. My heart bleeds for your loss. I'm sure it does. The Jarl's horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's tension. But I'm a practical man. Return my property, and I'll consider the debt paid. You can even keep your head. I hear hermits are hard to find these days. Beside Haldor on the wall, Astrid stepped into view. The rune-carved sword gleamed at her side as she placed both hands on the stone battlements. I belong to no one, you serpent, and I'll die before I let you put chains on me again. The runaway speaks. Ericsson's voice took on a mocking tone. You've caused me a great deal of trouble, little bird. But I'm willing to forgive past indiscretions if you come quietly. My clients have been very patient, but their patience has limits. Then they'll die disappointed. Astrid's voice carried absolute conviction. I'd rather burn this fortress around me than spend another day in bondage. Ericsson studied her for a long moment, then shrugged with theatrical disappointment. A pity. You were always the spirited ones who brought the best prices. No matter, dead slaves tell no tales about successful escapes. He raised his hand, and his men began to move. 4 dismounted and approached the walls on foot, carrying grappling hooks and ropes. The others remained mounted, circling at a distance, ready to ride down anyone who tried to flee. They mean to scale the walls, Astrid observed. Let them try. Haldor drew his bow fully, the arrow's point tracking one of the approaching climbers. Ironhold has seen off better men than these. The first arrow took the lead climber in the chest, dropping him like a stone. The second found its mark before the echo of the first man's scream had faded. Ancient skills returned to Haldor's hands as if he'd never stopped practicing. The smooth draw, the steady aim, the release that sent death flying swift and true. But Ericsson's men were professionals, not common bandits. They spread out, using the scattered boulders around Ironhold's base for cover, and managed to reach the wall and began climbing with practiced skill. His grappling hook biting deep into the weathered stone. Astrid appeared at the battlements directly above him, the curved sword in her hands. When he reached for the top of the wall, she brought the blade down in a precise strike that severed the rope and sent him tumbling 20 feet to the rocks below. Well done, Haldor called to her as he knocked another arrow. I had a good teacher, she replied. Already moving to another position, the attack continued for an hour. Ericsson's men probing for weaknesses, while the defenders made them pay for every attempt. But Haldor could see the pattern developing. This was just the opening round, meant to test their capabilities and identify the best approach. The real assault would come later. As if reading his thoughts, Ericsson called for his men to withdraw. They pulled back to their original positions, leaving 3 bodies at the base of the walls as proof of Ironhold's bite. Impressive, the Jarl called up to them. You fight well for a dead man and a runaway slave. But this fortress wasn't abandoned because it was impregnable. It was abandoned because sieges are won by patience, not heroics. He was right, and Haldor knew it. Their supplies were good for months, but Ericsson could afford to wait while sending for reinforcements. Every day that passed would bring more enemies to their door. What's your proposal? Haldor asked, though he suspected he already knew. Trial by combat. Ancient law, recognized even here in the borderlands. You against my champion, winner takes all. Ericsson gestured to one of his remaining men, a giant nearly as tall as Haldor himself. This is Gunnar Ironbreaker, undefeated in 43 single combats. Face him, and I'll abide by the outcome. Haldor studied the champion. Massive shoulders, arms like tree trunks, a 2-handed sword strapped to his back that would cleave a normal man in half. Professional competence radiated from every line of his body. This was no common thug, but a true warrior, one who'd earned his reputation in honest blood. And if I refuse, Haldor asked, then we settle in for a proper siege. I'll starve you out or burn you out, whichever proves more entertaining. The girl dies slowly either way. Astrid moved closer to Haldor, her voice pitched for his ears alone. Don't do this. It's a trap. They won't honor any victory you might win. I know. Haldor's eyes never left the champion below. "But it buys us time to think. I need until sunset to consider your offer," he called down to Eriksson. The Jarl nodded graciously. "Of course. Such decisions shouldn't be rushed. We'll make camp and wait for your answer." As Eriksson's men withdrew to establish their siege lines, Haldor and Astrid retreated to the keep to plan their next move. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that seemed to mock the gravity of their situation. "There has to be another way," Astrid insisted as they sat beside the great hall's cold hearth. "Some escape route, some hidden passage." "There is." Haldor pulled out a piece of charcoal and began sketching on the stone floor. "The old garrison records mention a postern gate built into the cliff face behind the keep. It was meant for supply runs during siege, but it could serve for escape. Then why consider the combat at all? Because running solves nothing. Even if we escape, they'll follow. More will come after them. This ends only when we make it too expensive to continue." Astrid studied the crude map he'd drawn, her mind working through the possibilities. "What if we use both? Accept the combat, but prepare the escape route as backup?" "Dangerous. If they discover the postern during the fight, then we're no worse off than we are now." She met his eyes steadily. "But if your champion falls, and they honor the agreement, we've won everything." Haldor considered this, recognizing the sound tactical thinking behind her words. Sometimes the best strategy was to prepare for multiple outcomes, rather than betting everything on a single roll of the dice. "It could work," he admitted, "but it requires perfect timing and more than a little luck. Then we'd better start preparing." Astrid rose and moved to the window, studying the enemy positions below. "How long until sunset?" 3 hours. Then we have 3 hours to ready ourselves for war." They spent the remaining daylight in frantic preparation, locating the hidden postern, clearing the escape route, and positioning supplies for a potential flight into the wilderness. But even as they worked, both knew that their fate would likely be decided by steel and skill in single combat. As the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Haldor stood on the battlements one final time. Below, Eriksson waited with his champion, confident in their victory. "I accept your terms," Haldor called down. "Single combat at dawn. If your man wins, you get the girl. If I win, you and your men depart and never return." "Agreed." Eriksson's voice carried triumph. "Prepare yourself, dead man. Tomorrow you meet a real warrior." But as darkness fell over Ironhold, it was Gunnar Ironbreaker who should have been preparing. For the Shieldbreaker was coming back to war, and he had more than one plan for victory. Dawn came grey and bitter, with snow beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes that clung to everything they touched. From the battlements of Ironhold, the world looked wrapped in white silence, as if the gods themselves had come to witness what would unfold in the courtyard below. Haldor stood in the commander's quarters, methodically checking his equipment one final time. His father's sword hung at his side, its familiar weight a comfort in the uncertain morning. The war axe was strapped to his back, its double-edged head gleaming despite the overcast sky. Mail shirt, leather braces, iron helm, all the tools of his former trade, brought out of exile for one final dance. "You don't have to do this," Astrid said quietly from the doorway. He turned to find her watching him, with eyes that held too much fear and too much love. The rune-carved sword was at her side, and she'd braided her hair back in the old style, a warrior's knot that would stay secure in battle. She was ready for whatever came after the combat, whether victory or desperate flight. "Yes, I do." Haldor moved to the window and looked down at the courtyard where Eriksson's men had cleared a circle in the snow. "This is what I was born for, Astrid. What I spent my life becoming. It ends here one way or another, and if you fall, then you use the postern. Get to the coast. Find passage on a merchant ship. There are places beyond the reach of slavers." He stopped, seeing her expression. "You won't run?" "No." Her voice carried absolute finality. "If you die down there, I die with you. I won't live as prey again." The words hit him harder than any blow. In her quiet declaration, he heard an echo of his own younger self, the man who'd rather face impossible odds than compromise his honor. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Then I'd better not die," he said simply. They descended to the courtyard together, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. Eriksson waited near the gates with his remaining men, all of them eager to see the legendary shield-breaker finally fall. In the center of the cleared circle stood Gunnar Ironbreaker, and seeing him up close, Haldor revised his earlier assessment upward. The champion was even larger than he'd appeared from the walls, perhaps 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could support a roof beam. His two-handed sword was planted point first in the snow beside him, its crossguard decorated with iron skulls that served as grim testament to his victories. Scars mapped his bare arms and face, each one a story of survival against lesser opponents. "Haldor Grimsson," Gunnar's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I've heard the songs about you. They say you once cut through a shield wall like wheat. That was long ago." Haldor stepped into the circle, war axe in hand. "Before I learned that some battles aren't worth winning, all battles are worth winning." Gunnar lifted his massive sword with casual ease, the blade singing as it cut through the morning air. "That's what separates warriors from farmers. Then let's see which one of us remembers how to be a warrior." They circled each other slowly, testing distance and timing while the snow continued to fall around them. Gunnar moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his sword weaving lazy patterns that could explode into deadly strikes without warning. Haldor kept his axe low and ready, waiting for the opening he knew would come. The first exchange was lightning fast. Gunnar's blade swept in a horizontal arc, meant to take Haldor's head off, but the older warrior ducked under it and stepped inside the champion's reach. His axe struck sparks from Gunnar's mail as the younger man twisted away, neither landing a decisive blow. They separated, circling again, each taking the other's measure. Gunnar had reach and raw power, but Haldor had experience and cunning. It would be a battle of youth against age, strength against skill. "You're slower than the songs claim," Gunnar taunted, feinting with his sword point. "I'm exactly as fast as I need to be," Haldor replied, refusing to be drawn into a rash attack. The second exchange lasted longer. Gunnar pressed forward with a series of overhead strikes, each one powerful enough to split a shield. Haldor gave ground grudgingly, his axe turning aside blows that would have killed a lesser warrior. But the relentless pressure was taking its toll. His breathing grew labored, and his responses came a fraction slower with each clash. Then Gunnar made his mistake. Overconfident in his advantage, he committed fully to a massive downward strike that would have cleaved Haldor in half. But the shield breaker wasn't there when the blade fell. He'd stepped aside at the last moment, letting the champion's own momentum carry him forward off balance. Haldor's axe took Gunnar in the side, biting deep through mail and flesh. The champion stumbled, dark blood spreading across his shirt, but managed to bring his sword around in a desperate counterattack. The blade scraped along Haldor's mail, parting links but not penetrating far enough to do serious damage. They broke apart, both wounded now, both breathing hard. The snow at their feet was stained with drops of red that steamed in the cold air. "First blood to you," Gunnar admitted, pressing his free hand to his wounded side. "But it'll take more than that to stop me." He was right. Despite the injury, the champion still moved with deadly purpose. If anything, the wound seemed to have sharpened his focus, stripping away overconfidence to reveal the killer underneath. The final phase of their duel was brutal and methodical. Both men fought with the economy of motion that came from years of training, wasting no energy on flourishes or dramatic gestures. This was craftsmanship at its highest level, two masters of war demonstrating their art for an audience of enemies and allies. Gunnar's attacks grew more desperate as his strength ebbed from blood loss. But desperation made him dangerous in new ways, willing to take risks he'd avoided when fresh. One of his wild swings nearly took Haldor's arm off, the blade whistling past so close it parted the mail links. Haldor knew he had to end it soon. His own endurance wasn't limitless, and a prolonged fight favored the younger man despite his wound. When Gunnar overextended again, reaching for a killing blow, Haldor made his move. Instead of dodging away, he stepped forward into the strike, accepting a shallow cut across his shoulder in exchange for the opening he needed. His axe swept up in a perfectly timed arc, taking Gunnar under the chin with the full force of his remaining strength. The champion's head snapped back, his sword falling from nerveless fingers to land point first in the blood-stained snow. For a moment, he stood swaying like a tree in a storm, then toppled backward to lie still in the courtyard. Silence fell over Ironhold, broken only by the whisper of falling snow and Haldor's labored breathing. He stood over his fallen opponent, axe still in hand, looking every inch the legendary warrior the songs had made him. From the walls, Astrid's voice rang clear and proud. "Victory to Haldor Grimsson, the Shieldbreaker! The combat is won!" But even as the words echoed off the stone walls, Haldor could see treachery in Ericsson's face. The slave lord's hand was moving toward his sword, and his remaining men were shifting position for an attack. The duel was over, but the real fight was just beginning. Ericsson's sword was halfway from its sheath when the new voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." "Brother," everyone in the courtyard froze. The voice had come from the main gate, where a lone figure sat mounted on a magnificent black stallion. The rider was tall and lean, dressed in the finest mail Haldor had ever seen, with a wolf fur cloak that marked him as nobility. A war hammer hung at his side, its head carved with intricate runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Ericsson's face went white as parchment. "Magnus, what are you doing here?" The newcomer, Magnus, urged his horse forward into the courtyard with casual confidence. As he moved into the light, Haldor could see the family resemblance clearly. The same sharp features, the same pale eyes. But where Ericsson radiated cold cruelty, this man carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd never needed to prove his authority through fear. "I came to collect my wayward brother before he did something truly stupid." Magnus's gaze swept the courtyard, taking in Gunnar's corpse, the blood-stained snow, and Haldor standing victorious with axe in hand. "Though it appears I may be too late, this is none of your concern," Ericsson snarled, but his sword remained only half drawn. "I'm conducting legitimate business." "Legitimate?" Magnus laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. "Since when is slave trading considered legitimate by anyone with a functioning sense of honor?" Father would be spinning in his grave. Haldor kept his axe ready but said nothing. This was clearly a family matter, and he'd learned long ago that intervening in such disputes was rarely wise. But he could see Astrid on the walls above, her bow drawn and ready. Whatever was happening, she was prepared for treachery from any quarter. "The girl is my property," Ericsson insisted. "Bought and paid for in Bergen's markets, and now she's won her freedom through trial by combat," Magnus replied calmly. "Ancient law recognized throughout the kingdom. You agreed to the terms, did you not?" "I agreed to nothing that you agreed in front of witnesses." Magnus's voice took on an edge of steel. "Your own men heard the compact. Will you break your word and bring shame to our family name?" For a moment, Haldor thought Ericsson might draw his sword anyway. The slave lord's face was twisted with rage and frustration, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. But then one of his remaining men stepped forward, removing his helm to reveal graying hair and worried features. "My lord," the soldier said quietly, "perhaps we should honor the agreement. There are other opportunities." "Silence!" Ericsson rounded on his subordinate. "I didn't ask for your counsel. You'll watch your tongue when speaking to my captain," Magnus interrupted smoothly. "Olaf Stormcrow has served our family for 30 years, with distinction. His counsel is worth more than all your schemes combined." The pieces began falling into place in Haldor's mind. The quality of Ericsson's men, their discipline even in the face of setbacks, the way they looked to this Olaf for guidance rather than their supposed leader, these weren't common sellswords at all. They were household troops, professional soldiers who served a greater lord than the slave trader they'd been following. Tell me. Brother, Magnus continued conversationally, does King Harald know you've been using his border guards to hunt escaped slaves? I imagine he'd be quite interested to learn that the men sworn to protect the frontier are instead profiting from human misery. Ericsson's remaining bluster collapsed entirely. He sheathed his sword with a violence that suggested he wanted to bury it in his brother's back instead. This isn't over. Oh, but it is. Magnus dismounted and approached the circle where Gunnar's body lay cooling in the snow. He knelt beside the fallen champion, closing the dead man's eyes with surprising gentleness. Gunnar was a good warrior. He deserved better than to die in service to your greed. He was paid well for his services, Eriksson muttered. Gold doesn't make a cause worthy. Magnus rose and turned to face Haldor directly. I apologize for my brother's behavior, Shieldbreaker, and for the necessity of this entire affair. You know who I am. Every warrior worth the name knows the songs of Haldor Grimsson, though most believe you died at Raven's Hollow with your family. Magnus's expression grew solemn. I'm sorry for your loss. Your wife and children were good people. The words hit Haldor like a physical blow. You knew them? I was young then, serving as a page in your hall. Your son Eric taught me swordwork, and your wife Ingrid once nursed me through a fever that nearly killed me. Magnus's voice grew thick with old grief. When news came of the raid, I wept like a child. Memory flooded back, a gangly boy with serious eyes who'd followed Eric around like a devoted hound. Magnus had been perhaps 12 when the raiders came, barely old enough to hold a sword. Now he stood before them as a grown man, a lord in his own right, connected to the tragedy that had driven Haldor into exile. I searched for you after, Magnus continued. Wanted to offer what aid I could, but you'd vanished completely. Most assumed you'd died of grief, or thrown yourself from some cliff. He glanced up at Astrid on the walls. I'm glad to see the reports of your death were premature. What do you want? Haldor asked bluntly. To make amends. Magnus pulled a leather scroll from his belt and offered it to Haldor. This is a royal pardon, signed by King Harald himself. Your exile is over, your lands restored, your honor acknowledged. You can go home. Haldor stared at the document as if it were a poisonous snake. Home. After 7 years of believing he had no home left, the word felt foreign on his tongue. Why? He asked. Because the kingdom needs you. The borderlands are in chaos. Raiders from the east, pirates from the sea, and worse things stirring in the deep forests. Men like my brother profit from the instability, while honest folk suffer. Magnus gestured toward his soldiers. I can offer you command of the border guard, a chance to protect people instead of hiding from them. And if I refuse, then you refuse? The pardon stands either way, payment of an old debt. Magnus glanced meaningfully at Eriksson. But some debts can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged. Astrid appeared at Haldor's side, having descended from the walls, while he'd been consumed by Magnus's revelations. She studied the scroll in his hands, then looked up at his face with concern. What does this mean? She asked quietly. It means I have a choice to make. Haldor rolled the parchment carefully and tucked it into his belt. But not here, not now. Magnus nodded, understanding. Take whatever time you need. My offer stands as long as the kingdom has need of good men. He remounted his horse and gathered his reins. Eriksson, you and your men will return to Bergen immediately. Your activities in the slave trade are finished, permanently. You can't, I can, and I do. By royal decree, you're stripped of your holdings and banished from the kingdom. Be grateful I don't have you hanged for treason. Eriksson's face went through several interesting colors, but he seemed to recognize the futility of further argument. His remaining men were already moving to collect their horses, clearly eager to be away from this place of death and revelation. This isn't finished, Eriksson hissed as he swung into his saddle. The girl may be free now, but there are others who'll pay for her capture, others who don't care about royal pardons or ancient laws. Then they'll answer to me, Magnus replied calmly, and to the Shieldbreaker, should he choose to accept my offer. The slave traders rode out through Ironhold's gates like beaten dogs, their leaders' threats hollow in the face of superior force. Within minutes, the fortress was quiet again, except for the whisper of falling snow. Magnus lingered at the gate, his expression thoughtful. "There's something else you should know," he called to Haldor. "The man who led the raid on your village. We found him. He's been operating from a fortress in the eastern wastes, gathering strength for another push into settled lands." Haldor felt something cold settle in his stomach. Grimjaw the Red, the same. He calls himself a warlord now, commands perhaps 200 men. King Harold wants him dealt with permanently. And you think I'm the man for the job? I know you are. Magnus touched his forehead in salute. "When you're ready, send word to Nordland Keep. I'll be waiting." He rode away into the swirling snow, leaving Haldor and Astrid alone in the courtyard with Gunnar's corpse and the weight of impossible decisions. The pardon crinkled in Haldor's belt like a promise he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. "So," Astrid said finally, "the dead hero has a chance to live again." It would seem so. And the woman he saved? What becomes of her in this new life? Haldor turned to face her fully, seeing the fear she was trying to hide behind courage. "That depends entirely on what she wants. I want to stay with you," she said simply. "Whatever you choose, wherever you go. Even if it means more fighting, more blood, especially then." She touched the rune-carved sword at her side. "I'm done running, Haldor. If you'll have me as a partner instead of a burden, then I choose to stand and fight." Looking into her storm-grey eyes, Haldor saw not the broken slave he'd found in the snow, but a warrior forged by hardship and tempered by resolve. Perhaps redemption wasn't something he had to seek alone after all. "Then we have planning to do," he said finally. "If we're going to war, we'll do it properly." The shield breaker was coming home, and this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. 3 weeks later, Haldor stood on the battlements of Nordland Keep, watching the sun set over a kingdom he'd once sworn to protect. The fortress was everything Ironhold had been and more. Massive walls, well-trained guards, and the infrastructure of a military machine that had kept the borderlands secure for generations. Below in the courtyard, soldiers drilled with the precision of professional warriors, their weapons gleaming in the fading light. Magnus had been true to his word. Within days of Haldor's acceptance, supplies and reinforcements had begun flowing to the border guard. The ragtag collection of local militias was being forged into something resembling a real army, and at its heart stood the legend they'd thought was dead. "Second thoughts?" Astrid asked, joining him at the wall. She wore mail now, fitted properly to her smaller frame, and carried the rune-carved sword with the confidence of someone who'd learned to use it well. The past weeks had transformed her, from refugee to warrior, and Haldor took pride in her progress. But more than that, he'd come to rely on her counsel in ways that surprised him. "Many," he admitted. "Leading men into battle was easier when I was younger. Now I see the faces behind the helms, wonder which ones won't be coming home. That's what makes you the right man for this." She touched his arm gently. "A commander who sees his soldiers as expendable will waste them on pointless gestures. One who values their lives will use them wisely." From the courtyard below came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A messenger rode through the gates at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cool evening air. Whatever news he carried was urgent enough to kill a good mount in the telling. "Report!" Haldor called down from the walls. The messenger dismounted and looked up, his young face tight with exhaustion and fear. "My lord! Grimjaw moves! His army marches west from the wastes, 500 strong, maybe more." The number hit Haldor like a blow to the chest. Intelligence had suggested 200 men at most. If the Reds' forces had grown to 500, the strategic situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. "Where?" he demanded. 3 days out from Thorndale village, burning everything in their path. "Lord Magnus sends word. They'll reach the main settlements within the week unless stopped." Haldor was already moving, his mind shifting to the cold calculations of war. 500 against his current force of perhaps 150. Poor odds, but not impossible if handled correctly. The key would be choosing ground that favored his smaller, better-trained army. "Send word to all the outlying garrisons," he ordered as he descended the stone steps. "Every available man to muster here by dawn. And get me the scouts. I need to know exactly which route Grimjaw is taking." The keep exploded into controlled chaos as his orders spread through the ranks. Soldiers ran to collect their gear, messengers mounted fresh horses, and the great war horn atop the central tower began its deep, mournful call that would echo across the borderlands. In the command chamber, Haldor spread out detailed maps of the region while his officers gathered around the oak table. These were good men, most of them veterans who'd served under Magnus for years. They looked to him with respect, earned through weeks of hard training and careful leadership. "Grimjaw's moving faster than expected," he began without preamble, "which means he's either more desperate than we thought or more confident. Either way, we can't let him reach the populated valleys." Captain Olaf, the graying soldier who'd served Eriksson so reluctantly, leaned over the map. "The old Roman road runs through Wolfspine Pass. If he's moving that quickly with that many men, he'll take the main route rather than risk the mountain trails." Agreed. Haldor traced the road with his finger. "Which gives us our opportunity. Here, at the Narrows, where the road runs between Devil's Rock and Thornwall Hill. We can't hold him indefinitely, but we might bloody him enough to make him reconsider." "A delaying action?" asked Bjorn Ironside, the youngest of his captains. "More than that." Haldor's finger moved to a spot 3 miles south of the pass. "We make our stand at the Narrows, force him to deploy his full strength against our position. When he commits everything to the assault, we execute a fighting withdrawal to the old watchtower here." He tapped the map decisively. "That's where we kill him." The officers exchanged glances. The watchtower was a ruin, its walls partially collapsed, and its strategic value questionable. But they'd learned to trust their commander's unconventional thinking. "The tower controls the only bridge across Redwater Gorge," Astrid observed from where she stood behind Haldor. "Force him to attack uphill, across open ground, with a river at his back if he tries to retreat." "Exactly." Haldor looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "But this only works if we can hurt him badly enough at the pass to make him angry. Angry commanders make poor tactical decisions." "And if he doesn't take the bait?" Olaf asked. "Then we've given the villagers time to evacuate, and we fall back to the next defensive line." Haldor rolled up the map with decisive movements. "Either way, we make him pay for every mile of our soil." As the officers dispersed to prepare their men, Astrid lingered behind. "You're planning something you haven't told them," she said quietly. "Am I?" "The way you kept touching this spot on the map." She pointed to a location near the watchtower, marked only with an ancient symbol. "What's there?" Haldor was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. The symbol marked something few men knew about. A cache of weapons left by his grandfather's generation, hidden against a day of desperate need that everyone had hoped would never come. "Insurance," he said finally. "Something that might even the odds when steel alone isn't enough." They spent the night in final preparations, checking equipment and going over battle plans until every man knew his role by heart. The assembled force was smaller than Haldor had hoped, barely 200 men, after calling in every available soldier, but they were well-trained and highly motivated. More importantly, they believed in their commander with the fervor of men who'd found a legend they thought was lost. As dawn broke grey and cold, the column rode out from Nordland Keep, with banners flying and weapons gleaming. At their head rode Haldor Grimsson, the war axe at his back and his father's sword at his side. Beside him rode Astrid, her mail bright with new polish and the rune-carved blade singing softly in the morning wind. The ride to Wolfspine Pass took most of the day, but Haldor pushed the pace hard. Speed was essential now. They needed to reach the Narrows before Grimjaw's army and prepare their defenses. Every hour of delay gave the enemy more time to potentially change routes or discover their trap. They reached the pass as the sun hung low in the western sky, painting the rocky landscape in shades of amber and blood. The Narrows were everything Haldor had remembered from his scouting reports, a natural bottleneck where the ancient road squeezed between towering stone formations. 100 determined men could hold this position against 5 times their number, at least for a while. "Deploy the archers on the heights," he ordered as his men dismounted and began taking positions. "Spearmen in the center, cavalry in reserve. And remember, we're not trying to win here. Just hurt them enough to make them follow us." As his soldiers worked with practiced efficiency, Haldor climbed to the highest point of Devil's Rock to survey the approaches. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the direction of Thorndale, Grimjaw's calling card, the mark of a man who took pleasure in destruction for its own sake. Tomorrow would bring battle, and with it the chance for vengeance he'd carried in his heart for 7 long years. But tonight, as he watched his men prepare their defenses with quiet competence, Haldor felt something he hadn't experienced since before Raven's Hollow, the satisfaction of leading good men in a just cause. "Nervous?" Astrid asked, climbing up to join him on his rocky perch. "Terrified," he admitted. "But not for myself. For them? For all of us. If we fail here, Grimjaw reaches the heartland. Thousands of innocent people die because I made the wrong choices." She was quiet for a moment, studying his profile in the dying light. "Do you remember what you told me that first night at Ironhold? About protecting what matters?" "I remember. These people matter. This kingdom matters. And sometimes the only way to protect something is to risk everything fighting for it." She placed her hand over his, where it rested on the war axe's handle. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together." Below them, cookfires began to bloom in the gathering darkness as the men settled in for what might be their last night. There would be little sleep for anyone. Tomorrow would demand everything they had to give, and more besides. But for now, in the quiet moments before the storm, Haldor allowed himself to feel something approaching peace. The shield breaker had come home to war, and this time he would not stand alone. "Signal fires," Astrid said suddenly, pointing east. On the horizon, 3 points of light flared in sequence, the pre-arranged code that meant enemy contact. Grimjaw's army was less than a day away, and the final confrontation was about to begin. "So it starts," Haldor murmured, then raised his voice to carry across the camp below. "All men to positions. The red comes with the dawn." The last battle of Haldor Grimsson was about to begin. The enemy came with the morning mist, their war cries echoing off the stone walls of Wolfspine Pass like the howls of hunting wolves. From his position atop Devil's Rock, Haldor watched Grimjaw's army deploy across the valley floor, a sea of shields and spears that seemed to stretch to the horizon. 500 men, just as the scouts had reported, but seeing them massed for battle made the number feel like 5,000. At their head rode a figure that made Haldor's blood turn to ice water. Grimjaw the Red had grown massive in the years since Raven's Hollow, his armor black as midnight, and his beard the color of dried blood. The war banner that flew above him bore the same raven sigil that had haunted Haldor's nightmares for 7 years, the mark of the man who'd burned his family alive. "He's bigger than I expected," Astrid murmured from beside him. "Evil feeds on itself," Haldor replied grimly. "Makes men into monsters if they let it." Below in the pass, his own men waited in disciplined silence. 200 against 500, impossible odds by any measure, but Haldor had faced worse and lived to tell of it. The key was making every arrow count, every sword stroke deadly, every moment of delay precious. Grimjaw's voice boomed across the valley, carrying clearly in the still air. "Haldor Grimsson, the ghost of Raven's Hollow. Come out and face the man who sent your family to the grave." The taunt hit like a physical blow, but Haldor forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what he'd expected, Grimjaw trying to provoke him into a rash charge that would waste his tactical advantage. The warlord had always been more cunning than his brutish appearance suggested. "I'm here," Haldor called back, showing himself at the edge of the rock. "Come and claim your prize if you can." Grimjaw's laughter rolled across the battlefield like thunder. "You always were too clever for your own good, but cleverness won't save you this time." He raised his massive sword, its blade dark with old stains. "Attack! Bring me his head!" The assault came in waves, each one testing a different aspect of Haldor's defenses. First came the berserkers, wild men frothing at the mouth, charging with no thought for their lives. Haldor's archers cut them down by the dozen, but some reached the barricades, where desperate hand-to-hand fighting erupted among the rocks. "Hold the line!" Haldor commanded, his war axe singing as it split shields and skulls with equal ease. "Make them pay for every step." The second wave brought disciplined infantry, real soldiers who advanced under cover of shields while their own archers sent volleys into Haldor's positions. This was where the battle turned dangerous as superior numbers began to tell. For every enemy that fell, two seemed to take his place. Captain Olaf appeared at Haldor's side, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "We can't hold much longer! They're flanking us through the eastern rocks." Haldor spun to look where Olaf pointed, seeing enemy soldiers scaling the supposedly impassable cliff face. If they gained the heights, his archers would be slaughtered from behind, and the entire position would collapse. "Signal the withdrawal," he ordered. "Fighting retreat to secondary positions!" The horn call echoed through the pass. 3 long blasts that sent his men falling back by squads, each group covering the other's retreat. It was a complex maneuver that required perfect timing and absolute trust, and Haldor felt fierce pride as his soldiers executed it flawlessly despite the pressure. But Grimjaw was no fool. The moment he saw the retreat beginning, he committed his reserves, fresh troops who swept forward like a tide of steel and fury. What had been an orderly withdrawal threatened to become a rout as panicked men broke from their formations. "The bridge!" Astrid shouted over the chaos. "If they take the bridge before we cross," she was right. The narrow stone span that crossed Redwater Gorge was their only escape route, and enemy cavalry was already racing to cut them off. If Grimjaw's horsemen reached the bridge first, the entire retreat would become a massacre. "Take 50 men and secure the crossing," Haldor commanded. "I'll bring up the rear." Astrid nodded and spurred her horse toward the bridge, her rune-carved sword bright in her hand as she led a desperate charge. Behind them, Haldor fought a vicious, delaying action among the rocks, his war axe reaping a harvest of death as he bought precious minutes with blood and steel. The retreat stretched across 3 miles of broken country, with Grimjaw's army pressing close behind like wolves hunting wounded prey. Every defensible position became a small battle as Haldor's men sold their lives to slow the pursuit. The plan was working, barely, but the cost was higher than he'd hoped. When the watchtower finally came into view, perched on its hill like a broken tooth against the sky, Haldor allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Phase 1 was complete. Now came the real test, luring Grimjaw into the killing ground and praying the ancient weapons cache still held the tools he needed to even the odds. The final gambit was about to begin. The watchtower stood like a monument to forgotten wars, its crumbling walls offering little apparent shelter to the bloodied remnants of Haldor's army. Below the hill, Grimjaw's forces massed for what they believed would be the final assault. 500 men facing barely 100 survivors who had nowhere left to run. "Are you certain about this cache?" Astrid asked as they climbed the narrow path to the tower's entrance. "My grandfather was many things, but never a liar." Haldor led her to the base of the eastern wall, where ancient stones bore the faint marks of old runes. He said the weapons would be here when the kingdom's need was greatest. His fingers traced the worn symbols, pressing in a sequence remembered from childhood stories. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding of stone on stone, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a hidden chamber. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and preserved by the dry mountain air, lay weapons that had been old when Haldor's grandfather was young. Crossbows of Eastern design, their steel prods still flexible despite decades of storage. Quarrels by the 100, their iron points sharp as the day they were forged. And at the center of the cache, a ballista small enough for 2 men to operate, but powerful enough to punch through a shield wall. "Greek fire," Astrid breathed, pointing to clay vessels marked with warning symbols. "I thought it was just legend." "Not legend, just forgotten." Haldor lifted one of the vessels carefully, feeling the weight of liquid death within. 20 pots should be enough to even the odds. They worked frantically to position the weapons, while Grimjaw's army completed its deployment below. The ballista went atop the tower's highest point, aimed at the bridge, where the enemy would have to funnel their attack. Crossbowmen took positions behind the crumbling merlons, their mechanical weapons loaded and ready. The Greek fire pots were distributed to men who understood their terrible purpose. "Look there," Captain Olaf pointed toward the enemy lines. "Grimjaw comes himself." The Red Warlord strode up the hill at the head of his personal guard, his black armor making him look like death incarnate. His massive sword was bare in his hands, its dark blade seeming to drink the pale sunlight. This close, Haldor could see the man's face clearly, scarred, brutal, and twisted by years of savagery into something barely human. Grimsson. Grimjaw's voice boomed across the hillside. "Enough running. Face me as your family faced my blade." The words tore through Haldor like knives, bringing back memories of smoke and screaming that he'd tried so hard to bury. His wife's voice calling his name, his children's faces in the flames. The terrible silence that had greeted his return to ash and bones. "Steady," Astrid murmured beside him. "That's exactly what he wants. For you to lose control." She was right. But the rage was building in his chest like a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. 7 years of exile, 7 years of grief and guilt and self-recrimination, all focused now on the monster who'd stolen his world. "I'm coming for you," Haldor roared back. "But first let me show you what real warriors can do." He raised his hand, and the ancient weapons spoke with voices of thunder and lightning. The ballista bolt took Grimjaw's banner-bearer in the chest, hurling him backward in a spray of blood. Crossbow quarrels whispered through the air like deadly rain, finding gaps in armor with mechanical precision. Greek fire bloomed in orange flowers of destruction, turning proud warriors into screaming torches. The assault staggered under the unexpected firepower, but Grimjaw drove his men forward with curses and threats. They came up the hill in waves, each one breaking against the walls like ocean swells against a rocky shore. Bodies piled at the base of the tower, but still they came, driven by fear of their leader's wrath. "We're running out of quarrels," Olaf reported grimly. "And Greek fire," added another soldier. Haldor nodded, having expected this moment. The ancient weapons had bought them time and killed many enemies, but they couldn't win the battle alone. "That would require something more personal. Fall back to the inner chamber," he ordered. "Prepare for close quarters fighting." As his men retreated to the tower's heart, Haldor remained on the walls with Astrid beside him. Below, Grimjaw had finally lost patience with the siege. The warlord was climbing the hill himself, his personal guard around him, ready to end this confrontation with steel and fury. "Together?" Astrid asked, drawing her rune-carved sword. "Together," Haldor confirmed, lifting his war axe. They stood at the tower's entrance as Grimjaw's boots echoed on the stone steps. 7 years of nightmares were about to end, one way or another. The shield breaker would finally face the man who'd destroyed his world, and only one of them would walk away from this confrontation. The final duel was about to begin. Grimjaw, the Red, filled the doorway like a vision from the darkest nightmares, his massive frame blocking out the light as he stepped into the tower's upper chamber. The black sword in his hands seemed to pulse with malevolent life, its blade scarred by countless acts of violence. Behind him came his personal guard, 5 men who'd earned their positions through cruelty and skill in equal measure. At last, Grimjaw's voice was a rumble of satisfaction. The famous shield breaker cornered at last, like the dog he is. "I'm here," Haldor replied, his war axe steady in his hands. "Come and finish what you started at Raven's Hollow." The 2 giants circled each other in the cramped space, testing distance and timing, while their followers pressed back against the walls. This was a moment 7 years in the making. The convergence of grief and rage and the desperate need for justice. Grimjaw struck first, his massive sword whistling through the air in an arc that would have split a normal man in half. But Haldor was no normal man. He was the shield breaker, and his reflexes were honed by decades of combat. The war axe met the sword in a shower of sparks, the impact ringing like thunder in the confined space. They broke apart and circled again, each seeking advantage. Grimjaw was younger and stronger, his reach longer and his weapon heavier. But Haldor had skill and experience, the kind of battlefield wisdom that could only be earned through surviving countless fights against impossible odds. "Your wife screamed my name before she died," Grimjaw taunted, hoping to provoke a reckless attack. "Your children begged for mercy I never gave." The words hit their target, sending white-hot rage through Haldor's veins. But instead of the wild charge Grimjaw expected, the older warrior channeled that fury into cold precision. When he struck, it was with the calculated violence of a master at work. His axe took Grimjaw across the ribs, parting links of mail and drawing a line of blood across the warlord's side. Grimjaw stumbled backward, surprise flickering across his scarred features. He'd expected the broken hermit, not the legendary warrior. "First blood to me," Haldor said quietly. "As it should be." Around them, a separate battle raged as their followers clashed in the narrow space. Astrid moved like quicksilver among Grimjaw's guards, her rune-carved sword finding gaps in their defenses with deadly accuracy. Captain Olaf and the surviving border guards fought with the desperate courage of men protecting something greater than themselves. But the real fight was between the two giants in the chamber's center, trading blows that would have felled lesser men. Grimjaw's sword opened a gash along Haldor's shoulder, while the war axe left a matching wound across the warlord's thigh. Both men bled freely now, their breathing harsh in the close air. "You're slower than you were," Grimjaw panted, pressing his attack. "Perhaps," Haldor replied, his axe turning aside another massive blow. "But I'm also wiser." He proved it with his next move. Instead of meeting Grimjaw's strength head-on, he stepped aside and let the warlord's momentum carry him past. The war axe's spike took Grimjaw in the back, punching through mail to scrape against ribs. Grimjaw roared in pain and fury, spinning to face his tormentor with blood frothing at his lips. "Enough games. Time to join your family in hell." He abandoned all technique in favor of raw savagery, his sword becoming a blur of deadly steel. But rage made him sloppy, and Haldor had been waiting for exactly this moment. When Grimjaw overcommitted to a massive downward stroke, the shield breaker was ready. The war axe took Grimjaw's sword hand at the wrist, severing it completely. The black blade clattered to the floor, along with the fingers that had wielded it for so many years of terror. Grimjaw stared at his ruined arm in shock, dark blood pumping between his fingers. "This is for Ingrid," Haldor said, his axe taking the warlord across the chest. "This is for Eric." The backswing opened Grimjaw's throat. "And this," the final blow split the red skull like kindling, "is for little Astrid and baby Magnus, who never got to grow up because of you." Grimjaw the Red toppled backward, his reign of terror finally ended. Around the chamber, the last of his guards fell to Haldor's men, their leader's death breaking their will to fight. The battle was over, and justice had finally been served. Silence fell over the blood-stained chamber, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Haldor stood over his enemy's corpse, the war axe heavy in his hands. 7 years of nightmares were finally laid to rest, but the cost had been terrible. Too many good men lay dead on the tower's stones. "It's finished," Astrid said softly, touching his arm. "Yes." Haldor looked around at the carnage, then at the woman who'd stood beside him through it all. "What comes next?" "We rebuild," she replied simply. "We protect those who can't protect themselves. We make sure this never happens again." From outside came the sound of horns, Magnus arriving with reinforcements too late for the battle, but in time to secure the victory. The kingdom's borders would be safe now, defended by men who understood the true cost of peace. 3 months later, Haldor stood in the great hall of his rebuilt home, watching servants prepare for the harvest feast. The walls rose strong and clean from foundations laid with hope rather than built on grief. This was not the exact house he'd lost at Ravenshollow, but something new and better. "The fields look good," Astrid observed, joining him at the window. The simple gold band on her finger caught the afternoon light. They'd been married a month past, with Magnus himself performing the ceremony. They should. We planted them in peace instead of fear. Haldor wrapped his arms around her from behind, marveling at how completely she'd filled the empty spaces in his heart. Our children will grow up safe because of what we've built here. Our children? She asked teasingly. I'm optimistic about the future, he replied, kissing her temple gently. Outside their window, the borderlands stretched green and peaceful under an autumn sky. The watchtower where they'd made their stand had been rebuilt as a monument to the fallen, its beacon burning bright each night as a reminder that some things were worth fighting for. The shield breaker had found his way home at last, not to the past, but to something better. A future built on love instead of loss, hope instead of vengeance. Sometimes the deepest wounds did heal, leaving scars that made a man stronger instead of broken. In the distance, church bells began to ring, calling the people to celebration. It was time to give thanks for the harvest, for peace, and for the second chances that made life worth living. The story was complete, but the life they'd built together was just beginning.